All right, everybody. Just wanted to start off and thank everybody for joining. I wanted to give a few extra minutes for people that are joining a little bit late. I'm going to kick things off. I'm Doug O'Malley. I'm the director of Environment New Jersey, and I'm truly thrilled to be here today with our partners from the Delaware River Keeper Network, Penn Future, and the Clean Air Council. What you're going to hear today is the second webinar in our series on the Delaware River, and a call to action. Specifically, what we're going to be talking about today is exactly that: how we restore life in the Delaware River and how we can work to make that happen. And we're going to be exploring in this webinar the legal and regulatory mandates from the Clean Water Act for improving water quality in the tidal Delaware River. And obviously, we want to provide more information how to get involved in this effort and actions that you can take to protect the river. As a reminder, we did have a presentation. It feels like it was just the other day, but it was on Tuesday, the 27th of April, on the history and the economics of oxygen restoration in the tidal Delaware. That is recorded, and folks can go back and look at that. And then we're also going to have a conversation in the evening in case members of the general public can't join during the day. We did intentionally make this over lunch hour, so hopefully people can sneak it in. And that conversation is going to be a focus on estuary restoration with a focus on oxygen economics and the path forward. And that will be next week, May 19th at 7 p.m. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Jessica O'Neill with Penn Future. And Jessica is going to give an overview of the legal framework that's applicable to the Clean Water Act, and specifically on the definitions of existing and designated uses. We're also joined by Dr. Eric Sildorf with the Delaware River Keeper Network, who's going to do, again, another deep dive on what the data says on fish populations in the river, and specifically the evidence of spawning, rearing, and propagation for our favorite fish friends, striped bass, American shad, and of course, the endangered Atlantic sturgeon. And then finally, we're going to have Jack Byerly with the Clean Air Council, who will talk more directly about the Delaware River Fish Protection Petition, which I think all of the speakers will be referencing, as we go through the presentation. And then just a quick kind of housekeeping note. Obviously, if people have questions, please put them in the chat. We are going to be working to leave time at the end to be able to address them. We had I think some good dialogue at the end of the last webinar. So, feel free to raise your hand as we get closer to the end, or to put in questions as we move along. So let's jump off. If I could move to the next slide. Oh, great. So that's me, just in case you can't see my lovely picture here. And then just a little background on Environment New Jersey. We build on a legacy of environmental advocacy over the course of the last 5 decades. We were officially founded in 2006. We represent more than 80,000 citizen members and activists across New Jersey. Obviously, the Delaware touches on many states in the watershed, and that's why you have kind of a multitude of organizations that are joining today. Next slide. So this is, I think, a great place to start because this is, for those of you that track the zones of the Lower Delaware, this is Zone 4. And this is a no-name island, or Rat Island, as it's known. And this is a beautiful picture, obviously. This is kind of the Delaware that we all know and love and recreate in. But the reason I'm starting with this, because this does show in some ways the paradox of the Delaware River right now. And I'm going to go kind of in depth and talk a little bit more on the journey that we've seen over the course of many decades to get to the present day with water quality in the Delaware. But the paradox here is that, while this is a beautiful shot taken in the early summer, this is an example of how even where the river looks nice, water quality has not fully recovered, and specifically this is within the hypoxia zone. And so that's really, I think, the paradox I'm referencing is that we, even as the river has gotten better, we still have an underlying problem with the river, with our ecology and with the health of the river regarding hypoxia. And Dr. Sildorf will talk about this later. He referenced it before. And this is really the thrust of why our organizations and many others have come together to urge the Delaware Basin Commission to upgrade the designated use of the river between Philadelphia and Camden and Wilmington to protect all documented existing uses, and specifically to upgrade the designated uses to not just maintain maintenance of our resident fish and aquatic life, but also the propagation. And this includes spawning and nursery habitat for migratory fish. And then specifically, this refers to the DO, as it's referred to, reminds me of my own initials. Obviously, this is dissolved oxygen, and specifically to change the dissolved oxygen stream quality objective from 3.5 milligrams per liter, which was set back in the Summer of Love in 1967, to a more ecological protective 6.3 milligrams per liter. So the reason why we're at this point, of course, is long and varied. And I want to go in a little bit in depth because I think it's important to remind ourselves kind of where we came from. Next slide. Obviously, the battle days of the Delaware, are within recent memory. Some of them obviously aren't. So, the impact. This is a fish kill along the Pennsylvania side of the river in northeast Philadelphia from earlier last century. Clearly, the memory of the impact of the Lower Delaware and what the Lower Delaware used to be isn't something just for the history books, which this picture in some ways is. This is something that is still within recent memory, and including not that my dad was fishing on the Delaware in 1950, but he could have been. And there are many people, including anglers that grew up fishing in the Delaware when it was a massively different river. And we're very proud to be joined by some of those fishermen associations as part of this petition. But the reason why it was a massively different river is quite simple. There was obviously a literal dead zone on the river that ran from Philadelphia 25 miles downriver to Marcus Hook. And that, of course, makes it impossible for migratory fish like shad or really anything to breed and to journey upstream. And obviously the reason why the Delaware was a dead zone, I think we just need to look at the industrial history of the greater Philadelphia area and Camden and Wilmington to kind of understand that obviously things were massively different, even in the middle of last century, with Roman Haas and DuPont and a set of oil companies and refineries. Obviously, that legacy is still with us. But as part of that legacy, of course, is that it wasn't just industrial pollution. It also, and it mainly was, untreated wastewater going into the river, and that obviously is still the impact of wastewater is still with us in the river. But where we were previously, was just massively different. You literally had the decomposing bacteria that give off noxious hydrogen sulfide fumes, that created a massive stink zone. There's no other way to describe it. You literally had boats that refused to dock in Philadelphia because it smelled so bad. You had, documented claims by Army pilots around the Second World War that you could literally smell the river from more than 5,000 feet up. That just kind of gives you an idea of just how bad it used to be. And as I said before, this is not kind of in the history books. This is within the memory of people that have been with us since. I think it's also important to understand that this was all obviously before the Clean Water Act, and then by the time we reached the 60s, we had a kind of a massive alteration of politics in the country. But obviously the water quality was still really bad. And in 1964, you had roughly about 1 million pounds of waste going to the river every day. And more than 60% of that waste was coming from sewage treatment plants, obviously with the focus being in Philadelphia, Camden, and Wilmington contributing the most. And just as a reference here, in 1964, the bacteria count at Philadelphia's water intake at Torresdale in the Northeast was more than 39,000 per 100 milliliters. So just extraordinary amounts. I wanted to kind of emphasize that because that is obviously the challenge in some ways that we still face today. Next slide. And the reason I reference this is because in many ways the standards that we have around dissolved oxygen really date from that era, right? They date from the 60s. They date from pre-Clean Water Act. They date from a really different era that we some of us have lived through. Most of us haven't. And then clearly the challenges of the river, and the reason I kind of picked this picture of the aerial photo is it's just to show exactly how much the river is crunched in here. Obviously, on Camden on the near side, and then Philadelphia in the foreground. You have literally millions of people within the lower Delaware, and then obviously the impacts of treated wastewater are still with us. Next slide. So this is obviously, one of the most important ways in how we measure success and renewal and rebirth of the river is that things have obviously gotten a lot better. If you are an angler, you want to go out and catch fish, right? You can go catch American shad. You can catch striped bass, and the return of those fish species and the continued existence, of course, of the Atlantic sturgeon are just a clear reminder that the ecology of the river has improved. One of obviously the rights of spring, of course, is not just baseball, as dear as it is, but obviously is the spawning process that we see each and every year. That spawning process did not occur, obviously, in the dead zone years of the last century. It is critical to note too that these species are not the same, of course, and obviously the short-nosed sturgeon is federally endangered, and that's a big reason why we're here. And I wanted just to talk a little bit on kind of why, personally, why the sturgeon is just so is endangered, and it is kind of so vulnerable and sensitive. And partially, it's just a basic ecology where the American shad lifespan is about 8 years. Striped bass live a lot longer, about 30. Atlantic sturgeon live a lot longer. They're not quite our age of life expectancy, but they're more than 50 years. And so, of course, that means that female sturgeon do not return to the estuary for their first spawn until she's about 15 years old. So that means that obviously sturgeon take longer to reproduce. And we've had close to a decade of the Atlantic sturgeon being declared endangered. And right now, there are less than 300 spawning adults left in the estuary. That's obviously a kind of a minuscule amount. And that's really the reason why there's been such a focus on this petition, because the population is so vulnerable and it is so small. And of course, this is a reminder too that, while we have seen populations rebound of shad and striped bass, the sturgeon used to be, basically the passenger pigeon of the Delaware, right? You have references back from colonial days of, the fish almost capsizing boats that were trying to catch it. And then at least within kind of, I don't know if you call the 19th century the modern era, but you had in South Jersey fisheries reporting catching hundreds of sturgeon in one particular haul. And then one season resulting in the catch of more than 5,000 fish. And obviously, the reason why sturgeon are so valuable, at least at that time and still now, is because of their eggs, which if you're prefer caviar, more power to you. But that was, the reason, that was part of the reason why the sturgeon were so valued at that time, and honestly valued still. It got so bad there was literally a sturgeon war between both New Jersey and Delaware. We do not have a sturgeon war now, and we haven't had one for a long time. I mean, that's because obviously the sturgeon are especially vulnerable to and particularly sensitive to low dissolved oxygen in the water. And so they also are vulnerable to, they love, they need flowing fresh water. They also need a hard-packed river bottom. And so in the lower Delaware estuary, that's found primarily adjacent to the Delaware River main channel. Obviously, dredging is a huge issue for those populations. It's a big reason why we have the moratorium on activity in the Delaware in the spring and summer months to be able to protect sturgeon. I want to reiterate here, sturgeon is a fickle species, but the low dissolved oxygen is a huge issue for their ability to reproduce. And so even as we've seen other species rebound, we have not seen that with the sturgeon. And this is not a population that has a big margin of error. Obviously, there are other challenges beyond just water quality. Next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of climate change on the estuary. This graph is taken from what I'm proud to say is a new report from EPA that just came out yesterday, looking at the impact of climate change all across the country. You may have seen some headlines of this yesterday. This data has not come out in more than 4 years, and of course, you can stick your head in the sand on climate change. It's still going to happen. And I'm especially proud of the work of New Jersey DEP and their 80 by 50 report to document, what a changing climate will mean for New Jersey. Obviously, the Delaware will be impacted as well. And I'm highlighting these particular graphs because they are referencing the impact of heat waves and the intensity of heat waves that we've already seen over the course of the last century. And obviously, those rates have increased over the course of the last decade. And as we see temperature increase and intensity of temperature increase, that will have an impact on the lower Delaware, because obviously the hotter it gets, it basically bakes the water. And so, high temperatures are not good for dissolved oxygen, not good for the fish populations. The other thing here too is that the warmer water temperatures have changed the ecology. So we're starting to see anglers catch shad in the Delaware Bay as early as February, which is about a month earlier than normal. And they're also seeing sea level rise, which is impacted by DP and Rutgers, predicted by Rutgers and the DP's own science to get up to 2 feet by 2050 and up to 5 to 6 feet by 2100. We will see sea level rise impact higher salinities as it moves up to the bay and the tidal section of the river. This is kind of well documented with the salt line, but it's a reminder that this is an impact not just for our drinking water intakes, but clearly for the ability of spawning success of fishery species, including the Atlantic sturgeon. Next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the question of existing use and designated uses. And this is kind of a question mark here. But it really is not a question mark. We'll hear more from Jessica on this, as well as from Dr. Sildorf, because this, I think, is the heart of obviously the petition, and the heart of our concerns is that, as I referenced before, the DRBC goal since 1967, since before the Clean Water Act, is maintenance of fish and other aquatic lives in zones 3 and 4 and upper zone 5. We have seen through DRBC studies, from 6 years ago, that successful propagation is happening, and that is a good thing. That is something to be celebrated. And clearly, we want to be seeing migratory fish reproducing and rearing every year in the tidal Delaware. Now, obviously, as if folks remember the last presentation, and Dr. Sildorf will go through this again, reproductive success varies from year to year, partially because of obviously the variation in water quality, and specifically related to dissolved oxygen. And so, there is kind of highlights, and the summer of 2014 specifically was a truly standout year. Some of the best water quality, the single best summer in more than 100 years. Unfortunately, the summer of 2014 was the exception and not the rule. And as we've seen with the recent summers, our pre-COVID summer of 2019, and obviously our pandemic summer of last year, 2020, we had dissolved oxygen conditions. The river really can collapse and reach lethal levels for aquatic life, including the Atlantic sturgeon. And the concern here is that we are still using the same standard that was established in 1967, that 3.5 milligrams per liter standard, and that does not work for young sturgeon. As we've referenced before, in 2020, the minimum dissolved oxygen standards recorded at the Chester gauge fell as low as 2.8 and 3.0 milligrams per liter. Obviously, that's just one reading. That doesn't mean that there was a a kind of a long-term reading on those standards, but it does show that the estuary is sensitive even on that 3.5 milligrams per liter standard, which we argue is not protective of the ecology. I think I also wanted to note here too that there's been a long history of obviously looking at this standard, and I think that's kind of critical to understand of kind of how do we get here, right? And so in the 1980s, the DRBC completed, as it's kind of referred to as the U.S. study, the Use Attainability Project, to evaluate upgrades that would bring the Commission standards into compliance with the Clean Water Act. And so obviously this, and at this point, is almost a generation ago, but this kind of gives an idea of the long trajectory of looking at this standard and the ability to increase it. And now we did see partial upgrades to primary contact recreation standards in the early 90s, in 1991, as a direct result of this project. The Commission did delay action on aquatic life uses and dissolved oxygen criteria throughout the 1990s. And then after kind of much work on this issue, the Commission ultimately took no action. And so that meant that despite all that work, we did not see the designated uses for aquatic life or the dissolved oxygen criteria in the kind of the key zones, zone 3, 4, and upper zone 5. None of them were altered. And so this obviously brings us a little closer into the present day, into the work over the course of the last decade, and the work that was initiated in 2009. And that work obviously, there's a long trajectory, even what's happened over the last decade. But I think it is notable that the process that was initiated by DRBC in 2009 led to the filing of a similar petition as the one we have in front of the DRBC right now, by a set of organizations led at the time by the Delaware River Keeper Network, as well as others. And that created, that petition was in 2013. 4 years later, the Commission passed the resolution in 2017 committing to the current 6-year process of studies and deliberations. At that being said, right, there was not a acceptance of a proposal to recognize fish propagation as a designated use, and that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later. There was discussion of this issue at the Water Quality Advisory Committee to be able to recognize the existing uses in the estuary for a fish propagation. That ultimately was not considered by the Commission. And that's really what kind of leads us to where we are right now, and why we have the petition by the current set of organizations in front of the DRBC. Next slide. And so we've already talked a fair amount about our friend, the Atlantic sturgeon. I don't want to kind of go through all of this, and this will be the final slide before I turn it over to Jessica. But I do just want to reiterate that the sturgeon is uniquely vulnerable, and that's obviously why we want to be able to use the tools of the Clean Water Act to be able to protect the sturgeon. So with that, and I have gone over time, of course, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jessica O'Neill, with Penn Future, to talk more about the power of the Clean Water Act. So with that, Jessica, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Doug. Hi, everybody. And if you can't hear me, please tell me in the chat so I can try to fix that. As Doug said, I'm Jessica O'Neill. I'm an attorney with Penn Future. I'm based out of our Philadelphia office. Penn Future is a statewide environmental organization focused on protecting our air and water and working on energy issues across our state and beyond. And I'm really happy to be here today joining our partners at Environment New Jersey, at Delaware River Keeper Network, and at Clean Air Council to talk to you a little bit today. I'm just going to give an overview of the legal framework that's applicable to the legal issues that we have been discussing and that Dr. Eric Stildorf and that Jack Byerly after me will talk about. I know a lot of our listeners are really familiar with these legal issues, and I'm sure that some of you attended our first webinar, which also included a similar discussion about the legal framework. So I'm going to keep this brief, and there are obviously legal issues that we're not going to get to in great depth, but I'm going to try to give a bit of an overview. And next slide, please. Of course, the overriding legal principles here come from the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act has as its objective to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Those are lofty goals. And what do they really mean? The specific goal is that all waters will be or will become fishable and swimmable wherever that is attainable. This means water quality, which provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water. This picture is taken from the New Jersey side at Palmyra Cove of the Delaware River, where apparently my family is today observing wildlife. And so, you know, we can see just the importance of the goals of the Clean Water Act in attempting to attain fishable and swimmable status wherever possible. So how do we get to that status? Well, the state sets water quality standards, and those standards then govern permits issued for discharges into those water bodies. Next slide, please. Water quality standards aren't uniform. There's not one set water quality standard for every body of water. They're based on the uses of the water. There are designated protected water quality uses that each water body must have. You have to set a designated use for the water body. Then there are water quality standards that set criteria. Criteria can be numeric, a certain amount of chemical or a certain amount of pollution may be allowed in a certain amount of water, so number-based, or they can be narrative, descriptive about what the water is supposed to be like, what the water quality is supposed to be. And these water quality criteria are also based on the use of the water. And of course, because the Clean Water Act was designed to improve water quality and not let it become worse, water quality standards also include what are called anti-degradation protections. Anti-degradation protections are designed to maintain the existing uses of the water. You can't let water quality backslide and get worse. You have to maintain and indeed attempt to make it better, right? Because you're attempting to achieve fishable and swimmable status wherever possible. Next slide, please. So you heard two kinds of uses in there, and that's a really important distinction. And Doug started to address this in his talk, and that's really at the heart of the legal issues here today. The first type of use is the designated use of the water body. This designated use is set by the governmental entity, and then that becomes part of the water quality standards that are established by the state and are codified in the state regulations. The designated use is sometimes thought of as the desired use or the water quality goals, especially in cases where the water quality of the stream or the water body may be below what's necessary to meet that designated use. Because the designated use is part of the regulations, it can be upgraded, or if it has to be, in some rare cases, downgraded. The designated use must take into account aquatic life, wildlife, and recreational uses, because of course those are the basic goals of the Clean Water Act. And the designated use, even though it might be only for a particular segment of a water body, has to protect and take into account the downstream sections of that water body. Next slide. Then the second important legal term here in terms of types of use is the existing use. Existing uses are those uses actually attained in the water body after November 28, 1975, whether or not they are included in the state water quality standards. Under the law, as we talked about before with the anti-degradation protections, existing uses must be maintained and protected. Anti-degradation means that they can't be degraded. If there's an existing use, you can't just let the water body become in worse shape such that that use can't happen there anymore. Again, the Clean Water Act is about improving water quality, not degrading it. As a result, the Act mandates that the designated use, remember that's the desired use or the goal use, must be at least as protective as the existing use, because the existing use must be maintained and protected. Next slide, please. And that brings us here to the DRBC, the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is an interstate compact which conserves and maintains the resources of the Delaware River. It's made up of the various states along the Delaware that make up the Delaware River watershed. The DRBC is the entity charged with setting water quality standards for the Delaware River. And this includes establishing the designated uses and water quality criteria for various sections of the river. These standards, these criteria, then form the basis for effluent limitations, the permit limitations in DRBC dockets. And those are essentially the permits issued to dischargers, entities which discharge into the Delaware River. And the water quality criteria set by the DRBC are also incorporated into the state's water quality standards. So the DRBC has a lot of authority here to set the uses and to have the water quality standards correspondingly match with those uses. Next slide, please. As Doug talked about, the DRBC has been considering the question of aquatic life use in the Delaware River estuary since at least 2009, and Doug went through a little bit of that history there. In 2017, the DRBC passed a resolution, and some text from that resolution is excerpted up on your screen here. And in that resolution, they found that water quality standards, including designated uses and water quality criteria, should be updated, consistent with Clean Water Act goals, as quickly as possible and practicable. And what the DRBC has done up to this point is further study. And in fact, there's been a great deal of study providing evidence about existing uses, and particularly existing aquatic life uses in the river. And so what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Dr. Eric Sildorf from the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and he's going to tell you about those studies and about what that evidence shows about aquatic life use in the river. Dr. Sildorf, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Thanks, Doug, for the great introduction. Thanks, Jessica, for laying out that foundation. And it's great to be here and great to be talking about this amazing recovery of the Delaware River, the welcoming back of all these wonderful fish, migratory fish, resident fish, the wealth of life that is returning to our river. I want to speak specifically to that question of the existing use and whether or not we have evidence that fish are actually spawning and rearing and in legal language or regulatory language are propagating in those zones of the estuary 3, 4, and 5 that are kind of part of the controversy right now. So let me dive into some of those data. Steve Tambini, the executive director for DRBC, has actually posted a link to the 2015 report, which covers much of the same data that I'm going to be sharing here today. So there's a deeper dive there. And we also covered some of these data in the prior webinar. So a couple of different sources for you to look at in addition to the brief presentation I will cover here. I certainly can't cover decades worth of data in just 10 minutes, but hopefully I'll give you a flavor of that and an introduction to help demonstrate how life has returned to the river. So first, a quick reminder of the restoration of dissolved oxygen. This is at the Ben Franklin Bridge. These are July data, 24-hour averages, which is the DRBC standard. And back in the 1960s and extending back into the 40s and the 50s, there was no oxygen in July. And usually for 5 months out of every year, there was no oxygen, right? It really was a dead zone. But with the DRBC regulations in 1967 and 1968, and then the Clean Water Act of 72 and the revisions of 77, and the efforts to upgrade treatment at both industrial and municipal wastewater treatment plants, we started to see improvements, more so in the 80s than the 70s. We got a little bit of a slow start, but a nice steady increase in the 1980s. And we started to attain the compromise standard, the 3.5 milligram per liter standard that DRBC promulgated in 1967, beginning around 1990. So really a success story of being able to attain that 3.5 milligram per liter standard. But also we need to recognize that that's still a compromise position, that 3.5 is intended to protect adult fish and not necessarily young fish. 2014, as Doug mentioned, was perhaps the best year in 100 years of water quality. It was great to see. We saw amazing numbers, particularly of Atlantic sturgeon after the summer of 2014. But a reminder that we have no floor is that 2020 dissolved oxygen again fell to some of the worst conditions we'd seen in the last 20 years. And so unfortunately, we don't see full protection. Again, something that has already been covered by Jessica and Doug a little bit are these regulatory languages about designated uses and existing uses. I just want to touch on the idea of the language that DRBC currently uses and has used since 1967. The term maintenance that DRBC uses is intended to protect adult fish. So fish that are less sensitive to water quality problems, including problems of dissolved oxygen, is the designated use for zones 3, all of zone 3, all of zone 4, and I'll show a map in a moment of where these are geographically, and the upper of portions of zone 5 down to Wilmington. Whereas in every other part of the Delaware River, all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean, all the way up to the Catskills and the Poconos, is designated for both maintenance and propagation. And that propagation word means that we recognize that young fish and young stages of other aquatic life, insects and mussels, everything that lives in these rivers are more sensitive at the egg and the larval stage. And so we require higher water quality. And so every other portion of the Delaware River is designated for propagation, meaning we are protecting that as spawning grounds, as nursery grounds. And so that's what we're looking at here is, even though DRBC designated it for maintenance in 1967, the question relative to Jessica's presentation about existing use is, do we only have maintenance in these zones? Or since 1975, have we actually demonstrated that there is propagation in these portions of the estuary? So I want to dive into that data and give a little bit of a flavor of that. Again, to give a sense of geography, zone 3, these are DRBC's water quality zones. Zone 2 is the first tidal portion that begins up in Trenton. The impact zones, this is a representation of the historic hypoxia, kind of the really bad old days, for instance, in the 1960s. But the orange and red zone of zone 3 begins in Philadelphia, extends down through Camden, and goes down to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Zone 4 starts around the corner there near the Philadelphia Navy Yard, covers the mouth of the Schuylkill, Rat Island, that photo that Doug showed early on, and then extends all the way down through Gloucester County, Delaware County, and to the Delaware-Pennsylvania state line. That's zone 4. And then the upper zones of zone 5 that also are designated only for maintenance. Again, we were not trying to protect a compromised position. It was a heavy lift back in the 1960s, even to get to 3.5 milligrams per liter. But the designation back then was, we're not going to protect this as nursery. And that included these upper portions above Wilmington in the state of Delaware. So that's zone 3, zone 4, and the upper portions of zone 5 that we are talking about. The data sets that I'm going to talk about, again, these data are also, at least in part, covered in that 2015 study by DRBC, are a study that began in 1980 by the state of New Jersey. It was primarily developed to look at whether or not striped bass were indeed spawning again in the Delaware River. And so we'll look at some of that data from striped bass, but they also record the abundance of every other species that is collected in that same survey. We'll also look really briefly, and my numbers are wrong. This should not be 111. It should be 123. So I missed that. Sorry about that. The second data set is a regulatory data set. The PSENG Salem Nuclear Power Plant was required to collect a fancy word, ichthyoplankton data in 2002, 2003, and 2004. And what that means is that you tow a fine mesh net through the water column and you collect the eggs and those early stage larvae that are swimming in that water column. It is a direct estimate of where fish are spawning and how successful that spawning is. So it's a great data set. These data were, again, the collection effort was repeated in 2018, although we haven't seen any presentations, or that data, broadly speaking, has not been shared with us. But it's fantastic. It looks at the eggs and larvae. It focuses in particular on 12 target species. A lot of these are migratory fish, although it includes some resident fish, and then 2 invertebrate groups. And then the third data set that I'm going to quickly reference is a state of Delaware. Delaware Fish and Wildlife looks specifically at the endangered Atlantic sturgeon. And beginning in 2009, they started just looking at the young stages, the year 0, year 1, and year 2 fish that are called river resident juveniles. This is when right after they spawn, they stay in the Delaware River before they make their first migration in year 2 or year 3 out to the Atlantic Ocean. And so they were targeting that beginning in 2009. And so we'll look at some of that data as well. These are the bad old days. This is the data from the New Jersey Seine survey for striped bass. And as you can see, beginning in 1980, it was pretty hard to catch a young striped bass. These are only young of year fish, right? So this is separating out the stage. These are only the fish that were spawned in the Delaware River that year. And you see a few numbers of fish, but it was very hard to catch fish in zone 3, zone 4, or zone 5 back in the early 1980s. But then with the implementation of DRBC standards, with the implementation of the Clean Water Act, by setting that 3.5 milligram per liter standard and getting improvements in dissolved oxygen, fish like striped bass, and not just striped bass, but striped bass is a good indicator, were able to return. And what we see is that every year in all 3 of these zones, in zone 3, in zone 4, in zone 5, the urban portions of the estuary, we consistently see successful reproduction of striped bass every year in these downgraded zones of the estuary. So the answer is yes, propagation is occurring and has been occurring for decades. Doug referenced the fact that DRBC looked at this in the 80s and 90s and failed to take action. We are trying to hold DRBC to account and say it is no longer time to just study, it is time to take action. We have been able to demonstrate propagation now since at least 1990. Similarly, for the American shad, the founding fish, an iconic fish in our early history and that is being celebrated with shad festivals up and down the river. These are from the ichthyoplankton survey, again, targeting those eggs and larvae. We see that for 2002, 2003, and 2004, consistently, the blue color are eggs, the white bars are yolk sac larvae, and the red bars are post-yolk sac larvae. So these are the very earliest life stages, is that not only in zone 2, where maintenance and propagation is designated, but in zone 3 and zone 4, those portions that are freshwater where shad can and should be spawning, we see consistent evidence of successful reproduction. Again, propagation by striped bass, propagation by shad in the downgraded zones of the Delaware Estuary. There is no question. The evidence are unequivocal. The proof is there. If you look at the fish and you listen to the fish, the answer is yes, propagation is occurring. And if you look back at the conclusions from that DRBC study in 2015, a study of which I was a part of, the answer is yes for all of the species. Yes for striped bass, for American shad, for Atlantic sturgeon, for white perch, blueback herring, alewife, Atlantic menhaden, bay anchovy, and Atlantic silversides. Consistently, all species are propagating in their respective zones of the Delaware Estuary. And then here is the quote, indicate that the existing use detained within the Delaware Estuary in the period between 2000 and 2014 includes propagation in these zones. There is no question the existing use does include propagation. The unfortunate thing is that without action and without additional regulations and additional protections for dissolved oxygen, we are threatened with lethal conditions for dissolved oxygen every year. This is a complex graph, and I probably can't fully explain it here. Essentially, on the x-axis are the number of good dissolved oxygen days out of the 92 days of summer. And so 45 days is about half of that. And so when you have about half of the summer having good dissolved oxygen days, what you see on the y-axis is the number of young Atlantic sturgeon, again, an endangered species, the following fall and winter. Do you find any evidence for successful reproduction? And when you have bad dissolved oxygen conditions, and again, this isn't just a year or two, it is consistently 4 or 5 years now since 2009. When you have a bad summer, you see an either partial or complete failure of a year class of an endangered species. The consequences of taking no action, again, studying for another 10 years or longer, is that we can have lethal conditions for an endangered species here in the Delaware Estuary. So again, going back to Jessica's question, does the existing use exceed the designated use? The answer is yes. Propagation has been demonstrated, and this is not an academic question. Like in 2019 and 2020, when dissolved oxygen conditions fall to 2.8 milligrams per liter or 3 milligrams per liter, yes, we might be able to check the box and say, oh, wait, but the standard is a 24-hour standard and we technically attain it. But these fish can't hold their breath, right? They can't wait for a 24-hour standard. It's the instantaneous conditions. And even 3.5 milligrams per liter is lethal to these fish. And so it is not an academic question. Action is needed. And so let me turn it over to Jack Byerly from the Clean Air Council to talk about how these data are relevant for policy decisions and what folks can do. So Jack.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jessica and Doug. Hi, I'm Jack Byerly. I'm an advocacy coordinator for the Clean Air Council. And Clean Air Council is a member-supported nonprofit organization that has been serving the Mid-Atlantic region for over 50 years and works to protect everyone's right to a healthy environment. And I'm very excited to be presenting today alongside our partners at Delaware Riverkeeper Network, Penn Future, and Environment New Jersey. Next slide, please. There we go. So we'd like to share an opportunity for you and your organization to take action to protect fish in the aquatic life habitat in the urban stretch of the Delaware River, extending from Philadelphia and Camden down to Wilmington, Delaware. And I'm presenting today to invite you and your organization to join us and to sign on to the Delaware River Fish Protection Petition. So this petition was submitted to the Delaware River Basin Commission on March 3rd, 2021, by a coalition of organizations, including those presenting today and a dozen others. You can see who has signed on so far on the right side of the slide. This petition lays out how DRBC's current water quality standards, which limit the pollution permit holders can discharge into the river, do not adequately protect the fish and aquatic life that have returned to the stretch of the river in recent decades. So as Jessica mentioned before, the Clean Water Act requires that a waterway's existing use shall be maintained and protected, and that a waterway's designated use must be at least as protected as the existing use. DRBC's own reports and external data has shown that propagation of resident fish and spawning of migratory fish take place in this stretch of the river. However, DRBC's designated use standards fall short of formally recognizing and protecting these uses. So this petition calls on DRBC and its member states to comply with the Clean Water Act and to formally recognize and protect the existing aquatic life uses that take place between Philadelphia, Camden, and Wilmington. So specifically, the petition urges DRBC and its member states to upgrade the designated use standard for the stretch of the river to include the propagation of resident fish and other aquatic life, as well as spawning and nursery habitat for migratory fish. Next slide, please. This petition also urges DRBC to raise the dissolved oxygen standard that is needed to protect the health of aquatic life of the river and support these upgraded designated use standards. So even though, as Eric has shown before, the water quality in this urban stretch of the river has improved tremendously over the course of the past 50 years, and fish have returned and dissolved oxygen levels have risen, DRBC's dissolved oxygen standard hasn't been updated since it was first established in 1967 and remains set at 3.5 milligrams per liter. A 2018 report commissioned by DRBC identified a dissolved oxygen concentration of 6.3 milligrams per liter or higher as necessary to support the spawning and rearing of the critically endangered population of Atlantic sturgeon. So this petition calls on the DRBC to raise the dissolved oxygen stream quality objective to 6.3 milligrams per liter. So overall, upgrading the designated use and raising the dissolved oxygen standard would place more limits on permitted discharges into the waterway to more adequately protect the fish and aquatic life now living and reproducing in the Delaware Estuary. And ultimately, we want to ensure that the water quality standards for this section of the river don't allow fish to merely survive, but to thrive for generations to come. So there's an urgent need for DRBC to act swiftly to upgrade the designated use in the dissolved oxygen standards, because each summer, the dissolved oxygen levels can dip to dangerously low levels and can create lethal conditions for aquatic life. And these decreased DO levels can have detrimental impacts on the population of fish such as the endangered Atlantic sturgeon. So it's worth noting that this petition is actually an update of a previous petition that was submitted to DRBC back in 2013. And since that time, DRBC has had additional studies conducted, but no regulatory action has been taken, and we can't afford to wait any longer for the aquatic life in the stretch of the river to receive the level of protection that it deserves. Next slide, please. So we'd like to extend an invitation to all organizations to join us and sign on to the Delaware River Fish Protection Petition. Your organization's support is critical in this effort to protect and enhance water quality in this reach of the Delaware River. Over the past few decades, we've witnessed the return of the American shad, the striped bass, the Atlantic sturgeon, and the ecosystem has rebounded with more sightings of bald eagles, ospreys, and herons. And as this region continues to grow in population and the threat of climate change brings more frequent and wetter storms, we need to continue to fight to protect the health of the Delaware River and prevent its water quality from declining. So calling on DRBC to upgrade the designated use and dissolved oxygen standards for this stretch of the river will go a long way to help ensure that the river's water quality and its aquatic habitat are protected now and for future generations. So we provided a couple links below. The first link that you see in the first bullet point is where you can review the full petition. The second link is where your organization can sign on to the petition. So we'll be emailing these links to everyone who registered for this webinar. If you work with an organization that you believe would be interested in supporting this effort, we strongly encourage you to sign on, and please feel free to share the sign-on link with leaders at other organizations that you think would be interested in supporting the effort. We'd love to have a broad coalition of organizations across the watershed and across state lines. And in the coming days, our organizations will be sharing a letter of support that individuals who aren't affiliated with organizations can sign on to. So we'll be posting this letter of support on each of our websites and circulating it on social media. And we encourage you to share it with everyone you know who you think would be interested in supporting the petition. So share it on social media. And if you work with a member-based organization, we'd love if you are able to share it with your members as well. In order to help protect the aquatic habitat in this urban stretch of the river for future generations, it's important to have as many individuals and organizations sign on in support of this effort as possible. Next slide, please. So this concludes the second webinar of our series, Bringing Life Back to the Delaware Estuary. And we hope you can join us for our third webinar, which takes place May 19th at 7 p.m. This final webinar will explore the history of restoration efforts in this urban stretch of the river and discuss future possibilities for further improvement. And you can register at the link on this slide here, bit.ly Healthy River Discussion. And we hope you all can join us. Now we'd like to open the floor for further questions.
So we don't have a lot of time for questions today, unfortunately. We've talked a little bit too long, as we are all want to do. But there are a couple questions in the chat that I think, and I'm going to direct to the first one to Dr. Sildorf, as I think this is best sent to you. There's a question about, is there ever a maximum amount of dissolved oxygen? Could there ever be too much oxygen, I guess, in a water body?
Yeah, so really interesting question. There are conditions below hydropower reservoirs where you can get supersaturation of gases, and that supersaturation can become problematic for aquatic organisms. That's not a risk here in an estuarine situation. We talk about the kind of equilibrium conditions. 100% saturation of oxygen is just the gas is freely flowing between the atmosphere and the river. And even an estuary like the Hudson, like the Chesapeake, like Barnegat Bay, like the Delaware Estuary, rarely gets to 100% saturation other than in winter conditions. In summer, we don't even get to 100%, much less those super saturation conditions that become problematic. What we are targeting and what the potential for this estuary is probably about 85 to 90% saturation is what was historically present in the Delaware Estuary, using internal and external references. So yeah, that does happen, but that's not really a risk in an estuarine situation like this. So good question, goes to kind of the chemistry, physics, and biology, but not a really big risk here. We are trying to get closer and closer to that 100% saturation. We can fall down to like 40 or even 50% saturation like we did last summer in 2020. That's our problem right now, is that we are too far away from even just regular saturation.
Thank you. We have another question that I think is also probably best sent to you about, are you familiar with work of a particular individual named Victor Schauberger in remediating the health of rivers using vertical flow guiding structures? I'm not sure we have any kind of specific remediation procedures or remediation kind of devices laid out in any of our petitions, but are you familiar at all with that?
So I'm not familiar with that work specifically, so feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be interested to look at that. There have been proposals going back over the last 50 years to look at re-aeration of the estuary, as a possibility, and there was shown to be some value in that, but it's energy intensive. It's not simple to do, and it's actually possible to let the natural estuary do the as long as we're not feeding the estuary with too much microbial food. So although some engineering structures and some artificial elevation of oxygen has been looked at, the more realistic pathway is to use oxygen within the wastewater treatment plants to get nitrification, to treat the ammonia primarily in those wastewater treatment plants through a conventional technology, standard secondary treatment, and use oxygen there rather than discharging those wastes to the estuary and using up the oxygen in the estuary for that degradation. So it would be interesting. I'd be interested to look at that. But so far, the natural reaeration has been the primary pathway people have looked at for getting to higher saturation levels.
Dr. Sildorf, I think that actually answers part of another question that we got in the chat about what are the implications of upgraded standards on municipal sewage treatment plants. And I think we spoke about this a little bit at our first webinar, and as Dr. Sildorf just pointed out, there certainly are some upgrades that would help facilitate this upgraded DO standard. And if you maybe just want to go into that a little bit more, Dr. Sildorf, about what the conventional treatment that you just referenced.
Yeah, so this again is conventional technology. There are some of the wastewater treatment plants that discharge into tidewaters, at Mount Holly, New Jersey, for instance, that already has nitrification implemented. Again, it's standard secondary treatment. Any wastewater treatment plant that is built now includes this nitrification step. But when these wastewater treatment plants were built in the 70s and 80s, it was not necessary. And so for cost savings reasons, it wasn't implemented. So plants like the 3 City of Philadelphia plants, the Camden County plant, the Gloucester County plant, the City of Wilmington, to get to a higher dissolved oxygen standard, and this is what DRBC is studying through a detailed eutrophication model, is the benefits that would accrue from that improved treatment. So yes, the pathway that has been identified over and over through various scientific studies is by implementing that standard conventional secondary treatment, nitrification, at the plants that don't yet have it, so that we're not using up the oxygen out in the estuary. So it is necessary to upgrade, again, our wastewater treatment plant. Again, it's kind of our investment in clean water. And then I think that's, a national topic right now is, do we want to invest in clean water and look at all the benefits? In our last presentation, if you watch the video, we talk about the economic benefits, and Jerry Kaufman is also looking at that from the University of Delaware, the economic benefits of investing in clean water. So a couple of economic studies showing that investment pays huge dividends on the order of $1 billion to invest in that clean water.
So we are at 1 o'clock, and so we are out of time. There was a question in the chat about, is there a petition for individuals to sign? And we will be getting that up shortly, and it will be circulated via email to anyone who registered for this webinar, so you will receive it. I am going to have to cut off questions now because it is 1 o'clock, but we want to thank you again for participating and for your excellent questions, and for providing additional resources in the chat. We hope to see some of you next Thursday at our final webinar in this series, and thank you very much for your interest in the Delaware River.